I'm Mike Frascogna. I'm a practicing attorney here in Jackson. Been practicing since 1972. Currently with the firm of Frascogna Courtney. My specialty areas are entertainment and sports law, international litigation, and alternative dispute resolution. On the side, I like to produce films and write books. I'm also a adjunct professor at Mississippi College School of Law, teaching courses in negotiation and entertainment law, and have been doing such since 1978.
So Mike, you're really a renaissance man of the 21st century. With all these different interests, what was it that first brought you then to law school?
Well, actually, it started my senior year in high school. When my father approached me and said, "Son, where are you going to college?" And I said, "Well, I think I'll either go to State or Ole Miss." He said, "Well, that's fine. What are you going to study?" And I said, "Well, I like history. I think I'm going to study history." He said, "No, you're not going to study history. You're going to study business, and you're going to get a degree in accounting. And then when you finish that, you're going to law school." And I said, "Well, okay, Dad, if you think that's what I ought to do, that's what I'll do." So I ended up going to Mississippi State, studied business, got a degree in accounting, and took all my elective courses in history because I was just fascinated by history, and it was my true love. So at the end of my 4 years at State, my wife, Judy, still had another year at the W. So I went ahead and got a master's in history because I had taken all my electives in history. And my father said, "Well, that's okay. That's a throwaway degree. You can do that, but you'll need to go on to law school after that." So at the time, I was running a business called Frascogna or Frasco Entertainment Agency, booking bands all over the South and working my way through school because I'd given up my track scholarship 2 years before, which is another story. But I ended up coming back to Jackson and going to the Jackson School of Law so I could maintain my business and continue to work my way through law school. During that time, my younger brother Greg, was at Millsaps, and we were both involved in the entertainment booking business together.
Accounting, history, sports, businessman, following towards law school. Already had met your wife. So how did you fall into the love of music and start a business?
Well, I'd always enjoyed music, and I guess my love of music started in college when I was booking bands to pay my way through school.
But how did you come up with it? So where did that idea come from, or what kind of music was it?
Well, it's one of those life events that just happens. At the end of 2 years of running track at State, I came home that spring and told my dad I didn't want to run track anymore, that I just wanted to be a student. And he said, "Well, that's fine. Well, how are you going to pay for it?" And I said, "Well, Dad, since I've covered most of these first 2 years, I figured you would pick up the last two." And my father, being from the Bronx, New York, said, "No, that's not the way we're going to do it. You need to find a job." And I said, "Well, I don't know, what job are you talking about?" He said, "Well, you can work in the laundry, or you can work in the cafeteria cleaning tables, or you can work in the landscape department at State. They have a beautiful campus. You could do those." I said, "Well, I don't want to do those things." He said, "Oh, so what is it you want to do?" I said, "Well," he said, "I know it's not study more. Do you want to have more time in your fraternity? Let's get to the bottom line." I said, "Well, yeah, that's really what I want to do. I'm going to be the social chairman next year, and I want to spend more time, getting good bands." And he said, "Well, that's fine. Here's what I'm going to do, son. I'm going to spot you one semester. Your first semester back, I'll pay for it. After that, you're on your own." So I was booking bands for my fraternity and developed the best collection of band cards on campus, and other fraternity social chairmen and sorority social chairmen would call me and say, "Do you know a good band on such and such date, and who do you recommend?" Well, it didn't take me long to figure out, I can make 15-20% of these, and I'll just start my own agency and print up my own contracts, and I'll start booking bands. Well, that took me all the way through undergraduate school, graduate school, and law school. And my brother got involved. So I guess that's where I developed a love for entertainment, and that was during the time when entertainment was really, really a key to Southern culture. I mean, we're talking in the 60s when all the R&B groups were so big, when the Beatles hit, the British invasion, and we were right in the middle of all that. And it was a unique cultural experience, to say the least. So when I got out of law school, everyone assumed that I was an entertainment lawyer. Well, I was just a guy that got out of law school that happened to book bands along the way. But there were a lot of folks out there that made the assumption, well, he's an entertainment lawyer. Well, I didn't turn that away, and that's what really got me going. And one of the advantages I think I had is that I had a specialty coming right out of law school, and built on that specialty and then branched out into other areas as my practice developed and the firm developed.
So just to step back for a second, your father seems just incredibly pivotal in this story. Sort of like opening doors, or at least suggesting doors, that then you just sort of went through and took the whole different places. What was the background to your dad? How did he go from the Bronx to Jackson? Who was this guy?
Well, my dad was the son of an Italian immigrant. He grew up in the Bronx, and as a young man, his guard unit was sent to Camp Shelby in preparation for going overseas, World War II. I think he was day 2 or 3 of the Normandy invasion. When he returned, he went to LSU and got a degree in geology, and his first job was with the old Pan Am Oil Company in Jackson. I was born in Baton Rouge, and then was schooled in the Catholic schools here in Jackson, and then found my way to Mississippi State. My father was instrumental in that he was the only child of an eight siblings to get a college education, and he was extremely forceful when it came to education. In his mind, education was the turning point for any individual, and the more education you could get, the better you would be. He had a great respect for lawyers, and oftentimes I thought maybe he really wanted to be a lawyer deep down instead of a geologist, but he had a scientific mind, and he was a kind person, so I don't know how he would have fared being a lawyer. But nonetheless, I went on to law school, and after that, because of my father's influence, not because he pushed it, I went ahead and got an MBA following that, and then got a master's in sociology after that. And I think that's all directly related to my father's concern that all of us be well educated, and we followed that. So he was an interesting man. He was a Yankee living in the South, but by the time I was a grown man, he was just as much a Mississippian as anyone who had lived here, through several generations. And he became very protective of the South. And when the South was criticized, it was interesting how he could point out situations in the North that if he hadn't been from the North, I would have never known existed. Every other year we would travel to New York by car, stay in the family residence that he grew up in, where his brother was still residing. And I would get to interact with my cousins, and I learned all about prejudice, not in Jackson, Mississippi, but on the streets of New York City. And it was just kind of ironic. And I learned about uninformed people, their view of Mississippi, their view of Mississippians was so far removed from reality that I was mesmerized by their ignorance. It was unbelievable. But nonetheless, that was my experience growing up, and I think his prodding me along toward education and providing me with those glimpses into the North, into a world outside of Mississippi were very helpful as I matured and became a grown man.
Michael, his history and sociology, close, they're similar but also different. How did that come together? What was the impetus between the history and then sociology, and how did that play out for you?
Well, they're both social studies, and I guess that's what I gravitated to, was the social sciences. And sociology, history studies the past events and the influences that created those events through gender issues and class issues and racial issues. Sociology then looks at groups and the trends of groups as opposed to events. And it was natural, and some of it had overlapping with, at the time I was doing some domestic work, which I don't do anymore and haven't done so for a number of years, but dealing with divorces, the sociology provided kind of an interesting look into trends. At the time, Mississippi did not have an irreconcilable differences statute, so everything had to be done on the habitual cruelty. And it was a joke. Everyone would go into court knowing that there wasn't really habitual cruelty under the statute, but everyone would go through this make-believe question and answer period to provide the judge, who also knew what was going on, that there were grounds for divorce. So I remember doing some research into that, and researching with chancellors and getting some feedback on the absurdity of our divorce statute not having irreconcilable differences. But all that was linked to religious culture, it was linked to the Protestant ethic. I mean, it was linked to a lot of things, and then over time it softened, and we now have irreconcilable differences, which is a much saner approach and calmer approach to divorce.
So you started writing contracts before you were a lawyer in your business with music, and then on the other side, you started having an interest in sociology before you even, in your legal practice, before you even went and got your master's in sociology.
Yeah, when I was involved in the agency, I prepared our contracts, but that was easy because I'd get the William Morris contract from New York, and I'd get the CMA contract from Los Angeles, from these big agencies, and then craft it and put it down into something we could live with.
How would you get that contract? Because it's before the internet. How would you go out and find that contract from the agency?
Well, our agency was working with William Morris. We were booking William Morris acts on tours, and so we were having to sign those contracts. And the same thing with the Los Angeles-based firms. Also, when I was at State, I was social chairman for Mississippi State my senior year. Up at Ole Miss, my colleague was Haley Barber. And so we were booking these national acts, or I was booking them and Haley was booking them. And an interesting experience I had my spring before my senior year, where I was going to be the social chairman, we traveled up to Charlotte, North Carolina to go to what is called a showcase event, where all the national agencies show up and all the social chairmen from across America show up and book their calendars for the next year. Well, Haley and I went up together on the train, and we kind of block book. State would book one night, Ole Miss would book the next night. But the real act that everybody wanted at the time was James Brown. That would be the most colossal act you could book, is James Brown. So we went up to Dolores Rossler with the Universal Attractions out of New York to try to book James Brown, and she just dismissed us. She said, quote, "You rednecks don't have near enough money to pay for James Brown, plus we know the other reasons why you could never have him. Go away." So Haley and I got together the next, that evening, and we talked about it and said, well, we've got to get James Brown. That would be the ultimate, to have James Brown. So we went back to her the next day and tried to block book it, and she said, y'all just don't have enough money. We said, well, how much is it? She said, $10,000. And back in 1967, that was a lot of money. That'd probably be like $100,000. So we had a plan. We said, we'll go right at the end of the showcase, and we will try to see if there's any dangling dates available in December, and we'll see if we can scoop them up and book it. Well, sure enough, it worked. And she was impressed with our persistence and laughed at us and denigrated us, called him a fat guy, called me a little redneck, Jewish woman, New Yorker, the stereotypical prototype. You can just, but she was great, gnawing on a cigarette the whole time. Long story short, we ended up booking James Brown. So I come back and meet with my advisor and show him the contract, all the contracts, particularly the James Brown contract. He said, we can't have James Brown. First of all, we can't afford it, and we just don't need that. I said, well, gee, Ole Miss has got him booked the night before. He said, what? Ole Miss has him booked? That can't be. And I said, you can call Haley Barber. So he picks up the phone and calls Haley Barber. Haley Barber says, well, yes, we've got him booked. He said, okay. Gets off the phone. He said, well, we can't let Ole Miss have him and State, so go ahead, but I don't feel good about this. Well, the next day I got a call from Haley Barber's Student Affairs Directors and said, Mike, has State booked James Brown? And I said, absolutely, we've booked James Brown. Oh, well then, okay, I'll talk to Haley, I guess we'll do it. And so both schools ended up having James Brown.
So, where we left off last week, we were just telling the story. You were telling us the story of sort of the dope-a-dope of getting James Brown to Mississippi with Mr. Barber. Can you tell us what transpired after you were able to convince folks to each allow James Brown to play?
Well, the dates were played in December of that year, and Ole Miss had the first date, and Mississippi State came in the next night with its date. So I recall, it's probably 1 o'clock in the morning, I get a call from Haley Barber up at Ole Miss, and he said, Mike, the concert was unbelievable. James Brown was unbelievable. The whole show turned up into it was a riot. And I had to pause and say, Haley, what do you mean it was a riot? He said, oh, it was great. He said, he's got these big old bodyguards who are former NFL football players. He got about 4 of them. And they stand on the stage, and as the crowd rushed the front of the stage, he said, because everybody left their seats and went to the front right toward the end because he had them all vamped up and, just taking them to a high level of intensity. Some of the college kids would try to get on stage. And he said, and these big old ex-football players would grab them and throw them off the stage into the crowd, and the crowd would just roar, and then 2 or 3 others would try to get on stage, and they'd keep doing the same thing. He said, and while all this is going on, James Brown is just egging the crowd on. The Famous Flames are doing all their choreography. His 9-piece horn section is doing his dancing girls. I mean, he had everything. He said it was great. He said they had to call in campus police and just maintain order. It was a riot. I said, well, that sounds great, Haley, but I mean everything came off. He said, oh, we didn't have a problem. Didn't have a problem. So the next night at Mississippi State, I had somewhat of a warning, and sure enough, right at the end of the show, he's working the crowd up, and they're coming out of their seats. Matter of fact, at State, the concerts were held in the animal husbandry building with a dirt floor where they would show livestock. And they were folding chairs down on the dirt floor. And then, of course, you had your mezzanine seating, I guess. Well, the people were coming out of the seats. They were charging the stage. All the folding chairs had been knocked over. It was in total disarray. They're going to the front of the stage, and sure enough, those football players are throwing them off the stage, and with each person who gets tossed from the stage, the crowd roars, and it just works up to a frenzy. And I'm standing in the back of the arena, right in the middle, and I'm slowly start to walk toward the stage, just taking it all in, and just amazed with what's transpiring, and thinking to myself, everybody's going to love me tomorrow because I'm the social chairman that made this happen. And about that time, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed two gentlemen seated, which was unusual because there was no one in the seats. But my gaze was on James Brown, and I felt this tug on my jacket. And I looked down, and it was the Dean of Men, the person who had confirmed the contract, seated next to the president of the university. And he looked at me and he said, "Mike, you've got to make this stop. You've got to bring it under control." And I looked at him and I said, "Sir, I am going to take care of this right now." And I lost myself in the crowd.
So just two questions immediately just popped into mind. First, so you lost yourself in the crowd, and then what? And also, so who is this enigmatic figure, James Brown, that could create this situation? What was it like meeting him, and how did that happen?
Well, actually, I met James Brown before the show, because pursuant to the contract, he was to be paid in advance. So Mississippi State had tendered the deposit of half the money, and then I was obligated to get the check to him before he performed, which was nothing unusual. So I went to the dressing room about an hour and a half before the show, and these two of his big ex-football player bodyguards were in the doorway, blocking entrance to the door. And I said, "Well, I'm here to see Mr. Brown." I said, "Well, what is your name, and what do you need to see him for?" I told him my name and that I was the social chairman and I had his check. I figured that would get me through. And it did. And so as I walked in the dressing room, I was amazed at the transformation that had taken place. Now we're talking about late 60s, the animal husbandry building at Mississippi State. It wasn't what you would call a really nice, opulent dressing room. It was bare bones. Well, his advance crew had totally just changed the whole room. They had brought in oriental carpet, they had hung drapes, they had his racks of wardrobe, his makeup artist was there, his hairdresser was there, his bodyguards were there, the road manager, his traveling ensemble was there. There was music playing in the background, and he was in a chair, a lounge chair with his feet propped up in a robe with an ascot tie. That's what I remember. And so as I came in, he said, "Mike, please have a seat." Well, I am stunned that he knew my name. Stunned. And so sit down and we get to talking. And now I can reflect. Then I didn't have a clue. But all of his questions were about me. There was nothing that he asked me about him. What are you majoring in? What are you going to do when you get out of college? Oh, you want to be a lawyer. Are you going to be an entertainment lawyer? He engaged me in things that were important to me. I eventually handed him a check after this brief conversation. He thanked me and he said, "Mike, could you do me a favor? Would you come back after the show and tell me if I pleased you and if I pleased the crowd, because y'all are paying me a lot of money and I want you to get your money's worth. Would you mind coming back?" And I said, "Oh, Mr. Brown, I'll be happy to." So I left the room thinking, wow, this guy, he cares about doing a good performance. He's interested in me, which he probably wasn't, but he made me feel like he was. And so after the show, I did go back to the dressing room. And the two big bodyguards who had previously asked me to state my name and my intention swung the doors open and said, "Mr. Frascogna, Mr. Brown is waiting to see you." So I'm on cloud nine after the performance and after these two big old guys know my name, and I'm walking into James Brown's dressing room, and he's got a chair right there in front of him. He says, Mike, because he's always hoarse, sit down. How did I do? How did I do? I said, "Oh, Mr. Brown, it was unbelievable. It was, oh, I'm so pleased. So you're happy. Yes, Mr. Brown, it was great." He said, "Well, I got something for you." And he threw his right hand back. I mean, it was almost like it was part of a show. He just threw his hand back, and one of his aides, bam, put something in his hand, and he whips around and he says, "This is for you." And it's a photograph of him, a color photograph, that says, "Good luck, Mike, on your entertainment law career. Call me if I can ever help you, James Brown." And all I could do was just stare at the photo. I said, "Miss Brown, I really appreciate this." He said, "Oh, you did a great job. I just love Mississippi State. I love Ole Miss. Maybe y'all will have me back. I really would like to come back. These were great crowds. Just really enjoyed myself." You know, it took me many years to reflect back on that, to derive the true meaning of what was going on, because as a senior in college, I didn't have a clue. But psychologically, from a promotion and marketing standpoint, from a personal standpoint, he hit all the buttons. And when he left Mississippi State, and I'm sure it was the same in Ole Miss, he left 10,000 fans that they followed him forever.
We could just talk, I can see, for hours just about the music and these stories. You're also a novelist, an interviewer. I mean, this whole idea of oral histories, we realized looking through your own work, you've been doing for years and years. You're a master at this. You have these documentaries. How did that story move from your interest in sociology and history and then becoming an entertainment lawyer and having all these stories of your own to where, how did you fall into starting to want to archive these sports legends and these sort of like epic local battles in the sports and the novels and in the documentary movies that you've made?
Our law firm represents an organization by the name of the Mississippi Sports Council. And the Sports Council was formed in around 1990 to try to bring SEC football back to Memorial Stadium. Because at that time, the teams had sort of wandered off to Starkville and Oxford. They passed bond issues. They expanded the stadium in those locations, and consequently, it just wasn't economically feasible for those teams, State, Ole Miss, to come back and play in Memorial Stadium. Prior to that, Jackson had really become the capital of college football in the South because it used to have double headers. You'd have State playing Alabama in the afternoon, you'd have Ole Miss playing LSU at night, all on the same day. And there's a whole story on why that got changed. It had to do with Bear Bryant getting beat in Jackson, but that's another story for another time. But the Sports Council was set up to try to attract those schools back. Long story short, they failed. They couldn't get it done. And so they opted to bring NFL exhibition football in. So in 1995 and 96, the Sports Council brought in the Jets and the Eagles, and then the Jets and the Oilers played exhibition football here. There had not been a game for maybe 40 years prior to that. But to fast forward, the Sports Council then decided it wanted to get into the publishing business, so it was instrumental in getting two books published, one about Bill Rayfield, the famous legendary coach at Jackson St. Joe High School, who coached there for like 45 years, and then when they reinstituted the Millsaps-MC rivalry after a 40-year hiatus. Jim Frazier wrote a book about that. So I'm attending a meeting of the Sports Council as its legal representative, and somebody says, we need to do another book. And I said, well, I've got a great idea for a book. We need to do it about high school coaches in Mississippi and why Mississippi is so different from a high school standpoint, high school football. And they said, that is a great idea. The next thing I know, a motion was on the table. It had been seconded, and I was getting ready to write a book on Mississippi high school football. Well, I tried to pull that motion off the table, but, it was all fun and games at that point. So I come back to the law firm to my two sons, and I said, guys, we're getting ready to write a book. So I pulled them into the cause, so to speak. We interviewed 136 coaches, former coaches, current coaches, to try to get the flavor of what makes Mississippi high school football unique and different. Not better, not saying it's better than Alabama or California, Pennsylvania, but its uniqueness. And we were able to discover those things that truly sets Mississippi high school football apart from anyone else. And in those interviews, we heard stories about this crazy coach down in Scuba, Mississippi, that coached at this obscure junior college, East Mississippi Junior College. And as it turned out, the stories were all true. Perhaps he was crazy. In 1982, Frank DeFord wrote an article about Bull Cyclone Sullivan, the cover article for Sports Illustrated, that is still today the longest story ever written in Sports Illustrated. And so after all the interviews for Gridiron Go, we were fascinated by all the rivalries throughout the state. So we then came with our second book, where we interviewed over 300 people for the Y'all versus Us book, Mississippi's top 15 high school rivalries, and then it led us to the Bull Sullivan book that we published after that. So call it just, I don't know what you call it, fate, but it led us into writing the books, really taking oral history and pulling it together. And from there, we ended up doing a book on Mississippi junior colleges, which Mississippi has the most unique junior college system in the country. So that's how we got into writing about oral history, storytelling.
So, in a nutshell, what is it that makes Mississippi unique? Whether it's with the football teams, or whether it's with the junior colleges, is there something also unique about its practice of law, the heritage that Mississippi has? What do you think that uniqueness is?
Well, when you take a step back, you have to ask yourself, why do so many famous athletes and writers, authors, come out of a state with less than 3 million people? I mean, that's kind of the first step, is take a step back and pose that question, why? And there are a lot of reasons. As far as just generally speaking, a lot of people believe that you have to suffer, you have to be tortured, so to speak, before you can produce the kind of literary genius that's come out of the state. And so perhaps it goes back to the civil rights struggle and all of that in the Delta, perhaps. I mean, this is supposition. I'm sure there are historians and psychologists and sociologists that have theories about it, but to me it's anecdotal what I'm saying. But you got to have a struggle to create greatness. And so Mississippi has struggled in its past, but in the wake of that struggle, it's produced a lot of great things. As far as the high school football, there's nothing like it in America. And you may say, well, I'm sure Alabama is like, no, it's not. or Mississippi or no, it's totally different. In Mississippi, it is so deeply rooted in the culture, and it goes back through so many generations, and there's so many legacies tied up in it. And then you get down to factors such as there are no large cities in Mississippi outside of Jackson. So most of the high schools rest in small towns. And the key thing in a small town, the school and the church. The churches have major influence on high school football in this state. Major influence. And so you just get into this string of unique qualities that we discovered in interviewing all the people that we interviewed and exploring the uniquenesses of the state.
Mississippi also is unique with its music that hits right away. What about with the junior colleges? What stood out for you there?
Well, the Mississippi JUCO system, as it used to be called, they're now called community colleges, except for Jones County Junior College, who elected to keep the title junior college. All of the other ones are community colleges. There are 15 in the state. And the first system of junior colleges was started in Mississippi. First in the country, started in Mississippi. Of the 15 junior colleges, 14 of them play football. And the league is divided in a north and a south division. So nowhere else in the country can a team play in one state and play its entire schedule and be proclaimed a state champion and then go on to play for national championships, which East Mississippi Community College has won 3 national championships in the last 4 years. They're located over in Scuba, Mississippi. Most people in Mississippi have never been to Scuba. But if you want to watch good football, you need to go to Scuba. But the junior colleges developed this reputation when, at the end of World War II and World War I, all the soldiers coming back on the GI Bills would get into these junior colleges and play football. Well, we're talking about men. We're talking about war veterans. We're talking about guys who had been involved in hand-to-hand combat. And so they brought a certain roughness to the league that reputation just materialized and everybody hung on to it. So if you haven't been to a JUCO football game, you don't know what a real street fight is like. It's not the SEC, it's the underbelly. It is rough and it is tough, and that is why most kids who finish 2 years of JUCO football in Mississippi, if they get their degree and if they want to play, they'll play at a 4-year school. And when I say most, I'm talking about 95% and up. That's the reputation of Mississippi's junior college football across the country.
How did these oral histories that you were laying down in the novels transition to your documentary work in film?
We were approached by the Mississippi High School Activity Association here in Mississippi. The executive director at the time was Ennis Proctor. And Ennis and his staff had helped us with Gridiron Gold, the first book. And they were instrumental in getting us in for interviews and were very helpful in the entire project. And I was at lunch one day with Dr. Proctor, and we were talking and we were reminiscing about the book. And he's, I think just out of the blue, Dr. Proctor said, "Oh, wouldn't it be great if we had a movie of the book?" And that's all it took. I mean, we were on go before he ever said it. We had thought about it, but just kind of pushed it back. And I said, "Well, Ennis, we can make that happen." So we went out and found a sponsor, a major corporation, that agreed to underwrite the documentary, much like PBS sponsorships. And it took us about 2 years to film it and to then go into post-production and put it together. And when it premiered, we allowed any school in Mississippi to premiere it, either at the school, in their local theater, their local church. And I think the summer of the premieres, there were close to 100 premieres across the state put on by the local schools. And of course, not everyone could be in the movie, and sadly, so much of the footage falls to the cutting room floor. But it wasn't about a particular school. It was about Mississippi high school football in general and what it means to the state and how it got to the position that it occupies now in the state, which stretches back way, way, way back in time.
So this is not only a project of love, but this is a project of love not only in your own life, but this was done with your sons.
Yes.
It's a family project.
Well, that's what made all of this special because, like a lot of fathers, I got the opportunity to coach my two boys when they were coming up in elementary school, and even coach one of them through junior high as a volunteer head junior high coach. So we had established, the bond, father-son bond through football. And then both my boys, of course, played high school ball and went on to play college ball. So that had been something that had always we enjoyed together. Then they became lawyers, and there wasn't as much joy in that as it was in football. But all of a sudden, we found ourselves involved in projects where we could call upon those old memories, those past memories, those good memories, and travel across the state, talk to football coaches. I mean, nothing's more fun than talking football coaches. And meet mayors and aldermen from all these small towns and get to know the principals and the superintendents. And we didn't set out to establish a network, but when it was all over and done with through all the interviews and all the travels, there's not a town in Mississippi that we don't know somebody. And if you know the head coach, you're in. Even the highway patrol treats you with some respect if you know those head coaches. So it turned out to be a pleasure in doing it, and then the residual benefits, which we never counted on, were also a lot of fun.
So what's the future that you and your boys imagine with these projects?
I don't know that there is a future per se for my two sons and I as filmmakers and as novelists. We did it for the love of the game, to use that phrase. Any project that has those characteristics of what we've done in the past, we'd probably be interested in doing. Our latest documentary is about St. Joe High School, a school that's 145 years old. A marvelous project, but there's stories like that all over the state. I mean, that's what makes it so fulfilling and so much fun, is it's an endless number of projects. You could go to almost any town in Mississippi and there's a story. There's a book and there's a documentary.